The doctor confirmed Sandra pregnant. She wept uncontrollably. It was as though the years of despair had finally lifted, replaced by an overwhelming sense of purpose. When Philip was born, Sandra felt an indescribable connection. She stared at his tiny face, memorizing every feature, and marveled at the way his fingers curled instinctively around hers. "My miracle," she whispered repeatedly, her voice trembling with emotion. For Sandra, Philip wasn't just her son. He was a testament to her perseverance, faith, and love. Victor, though overjoyed, noticed an immediate change in Sandra. She became fiercely protective, reluctant to let anyone else hold or even come near Philip. When her mother offered to stay with him for a few weeks to help, Sandra politely declined, insisting she could handle everything on her own. "I've waited so long for him," she told Victor one night. "I want to cherish every moment myself." As Philip grew, Sandra's devotion deepened. She meticulously documented his milestones, from his first toothless smile to his wobbly first steps. Every decision, no matter how small, was weighed carefully. She agonized over the best brands of baby formula, the safest toys, and even the softest fabrics for his clothes. Victor occasionally felt like a bystander in his own family. He adored Philip but struggled to find his place in their tightly knit bond. When he tried to suggest taking Philip to the park or reading him bedtime stories, Sandra often stepped in. "I've got it," she would say, her tone warm but firm. Victor's concerns simmered beneath the surface, but he kept them to himself, hoping Sandra would eventually find balance. As the months turned into years, Sandra's world became smaller, revolving solely around Philip. She stopped attending church events and rarely visited friends. Every decision and conversation tied back to her son. Though her love for Philip was undeniable, cracks began to form in her relationships with others, particularly Victor. Still, Sandra remained blind to the brewing tension. In her eyes, Philip was her greatest achievement, her second chance at life, and nothing else mattered as much. Little did she know that her unwavering devotion, while born of love, would soon sow the seeds of something far more complicated and dangerous. Philip was 9 years old now, and Sandra's devotion to him had only intensified. They lived and felt like a shrine to his existence, every wall adorned with framed pictures of his milestones. His first birthday, his first day at school, his first drawing hung with pride in the living room. Sandra rarely spoke of anything, or anyone else, and her conversations with Victor often centered solely on Philip's needs, achievements, and potential. Philip was a bright, observant boy with an air of confidence that Sandra often took as a reflection of her parenting. He was polite, charming, and quick to please his mother, but something unspoken simmered beneath his composed demeanor. When he interacted with others, his classmates or teachers, it was clear he had little interest in forging connections. To Sandra, this wasn't a problem. "He doesn't need them," she would say dismissively to Victor. "He's special. They just don't understand him like I do." Victor, however, was growing increasingly concerned. He noticed how Philip rarely played with children his age, preferring instead to hover near Sandra. His social skills seemed underdeveloped, and his temper flared whenever Sandra's attention was diverted, even briefly. At family gatherings, Philip would cling to her side, glaring at anyone who tried to pull her into a conversation. One afternoon, Victor decided to address his concerns. "Sandra, don't you think Philip should spend more time with other kids? Maybe join a sports team or take a class. He needs to socialize." Sandra bristled, her lips tightening as she set down her coffee cup. "He's perfectly fine, Victor. He's not like other children. He's sensitive. Putting him in some chaotic group activity will only overwhelm him." "It's not about sensitivity," Victor countered, trying to keep his voice calm. "It's about balance. You can't be his entire world forever." Sandra's eyes flashed with anger. "And why not? I'm his mother. No one will ever love him like I do." Victor sighed, realizing the futility of the conversation. He often felt powerless when it came to Philip and Sandra. They shared a bond so intense it seemed impenetrable, leaving Victor on the periphery of his own family. Meanwhile, Philip began showing signs of possessiveness that unsettled even Sandra. If she spent too long on a phone call or tried to take a moment for herself, Philip would sulk or throw a tantrum. "Why are you talking to Grandma for so long?" he demanded one evening. "Mommy will always make time for you," she cooed, wrapping him in a tight hug. At school, teachers noticed Philip's reluctance to engage with others. One day, his teacher called Sandra in for a meeting. "Philip is incredibly bright," she began carefully, "but he struggles to collaborate with his classmates. He tends to isolate himself and seems overly dependent on you." Sandra bristled at the critique, her defenses flaring. "Philip is an independent thinker," she replied curtly. "He doesn't need to conform to other children's ways. Besides, he's still young. He'll grow out of it." But Philip wasn't growing out of it. He was growing into it. One evening, Victor came home to find Philip seated at the dining table, his face flushed with anger as Sandra tried to calm him down. "What's going on?" Victor asked. "He didn't like that I was on the phone with you," Sandra admitted sheepishly, stroking Philip's hair. "He got upset." Victor's stomach churned. "Sandra, this isn't normal." But Sandra dismissed him again. "He's just sensitive. He loves me. That's all." What Victor couldn't yet articulate, and what Sandra refused to see, was that their bond wasn't just close. It was suffocating, not only for Philip but for everyone around them. Sandra continued to indulge his every demand. She unknowingly fed the growing shadow within her son, a darkness she was too blinded by love to recognize. Philip's possessiveness deepened as he entered his teenage years, shifting from harmless dependency to something more alarming. He rarely left Sandra's side, preferring her company over friends or activities that typical boys his age enjoyed. His gaze, once filled with innocent admiration, now carried an unsettling intensity whenever he looked at his mother. Victor's unease grew as Philip's behavior became increasingly erratic. He noticed how Philip would hover in the kitchen while Sandra cooked, watching her every move, or how he would stand outside the bathroom door, waiting for her to emerge. If Victor tried to engage Sandra in conversation or suggest a family outing, Philip would interject, steering the plans to focus solely on him and his preferences. One evening, as the family sat in the living room, Victor suggested a weekend camping trip. "It'll be good for us to get some fresh air, bond as a family." Philip's reaction was immediate and sharp. "We don't need to go anywhere. We're fine here," he said, his voice tinged with defiance. He shot a glare at Victor, as though challenging his authority. Sandra, ever the peacemaker, tried to diffuse the tension. "Maybe another time, Victor. Philip's been busy with school. He needs to rest." But Victor wouldn't let it go. "This isn't healthy, Sandra. He's becoming too attached. He needs to learn independence." Philip stood abruptly, his fists clenched. "You just don't understand. Mom and I don't need anyone else," he shouted before storming out of the room. Victor turned to Sandra, his frustration evident. "Do you see what's happening? He's treating you like you're his entire world. This isn't normal." Sandra hesitated, her resolve faltering for the first time. "He's just going through a phase," she said, but even she didn't sound convinced. Philip's behavior only worsened in the following weeks. He became increasingly territorial, snapping at anyone who occupied Sandra's attention for too long. One evening, Sandra's mother came over for dinner and casually suggested that Sandra should start pursuing hobbies again, perhaps join a book club or take up gardening. "You don't need to tell her what to do," Philip interjected coldly, his eyes narrowing at his grandmother. "Philip?" Sandra gasped, mortified. "Apologize to your grandmother." But Philip didn't back down. "She doesn't need to waste time with silly things. She's fine the way she is." After her mother left, Victor confronted Sandra again. "This can't keep going on. He's starting to control you, Sandra. If you keep letting him act this way, it's only going to get worse." But Sandra, torn between her love for her son and the growing unease in her heart, brushed him off once more. "He's just protective, Victor. He's afraid of losing me. Can't you see that?" What Sandra refused to acknowledge, or couldn't bear to admit, was that Philip's love was no longer innocent. It was possessive, obsessive, and suffocating. It wasn't just Victor who felt shut out. Sandra herself was beginning to feel trapped in the very bond she had nurtured. Sandra sat in the pastor's office, her hands trembling as she recounted the changes in Philip's behavior. Victor had finally convinced her to seek help, though she came reluctantly, clutching tightly to her belief that she alone could fix. What was broken? The pastor, an older man with kind eyes, listened intently, his brow furrowing as Sandra described Philip's possessiveness, his anger, and the way he seemed to view her as his sole source of happiness. "I don't know what's happening," Sandra whispered, tears pooling in her eyes. "He's my son. I've done everything for him, loved him with all my heart. How could that be wrong?" The pastor leaned forward. "Sandra, love is never wrong. But when love creates dependency instead of growth, it can become harmful. Philip needs boundaries. Without them, his behavior will only worsen." Sandra nodded faintly, but doubt lingered in her heart. She couldn't shake the guilt that perhaps she had failed Philip in some way. Had her devotion stifled him? Had her constant presence denied him the chance to grow into his own person? The next step was therapy. Victor scheduled an appointment with a child psychologist, though Philip resisted the idea vehemently. "I don't need a stranger poking into my head," he yelled one evening. "I'm fine, Mom. Tell him I'm fine." Sandra, torn between Philip's protests and Victor's insistence, coaxed her son into attending the first session. But the meeting was disastrous. Philip remained silent, arms crossed and eyes fixed on the floor, refusing to answer the therapist's questions. Sandra tried to intervene, but the therapist stopped her gently. "He has to want to engage, Mrs. We can't force him." Victor, however, refused to give up. He arranged a spiritual deliverance session at their local church, hoping that faith might succeed where therapy had failed. Sandra, though hesitant, agreed, desperate for any solution. During the deliverance, Philip's behavior took a dark turn. He lashed out violently, yelling that he didn't need to be saved and accusing Victor of trying to take Sandra away from him. The congregation watched in stunned silence as the boy's fury seemed almost otherworldly. Later that night, Sandra sat alone in the darkened living room, her hands shaking as she replayed the events in her mind. She couldn't deny it anymore. Something was deeply wrong with Philip, his anger, his possessiveness. It was as if he were spiraling into a darkness she couldn't reach. Victor approached her, his voice gentle but firm. "Sandra, we've done everything we can. We can't handle this on our own anymore." Sandra looked at him, her face pale and etched with fear. "I just wanted to protect him," she murmured. "I wanted to give him the love I never had." Victor placed a hand on her shoulder. "And you did. But love without limits isn't love, Sandra. It's control. And now, we have to face the consequences." Sandra's heart shattered as she realized the truth in Victor's words. Yet, even as her world crumbled, she clung to a fragile hope that it wasn't too late to save her son and herself. The confrontation came on a stormy evening. Philip had become more volatile. That night, Sandra had stepped out to meet Victor's mother, an errand she knew Philip would disapprove of, but felt compelled to undertake. When she returned, Philip was waiting in the dimly lit hallway, his face shadowed by anger. "Where were you?" he demanded, his voice sharp and trembling. Sandra froze, her heart pounding. "I was visiting Grandma," she replied, her voice calm but firm. "You didn't tell me," Philip snapped, stepping closer. "You didn't ask me." "Philip, I don't need your permission," Sandra said, the authority in her tone surprising even herself. Something shifted in Philip's expression, a flicker of realization, a crack in the facade of control he'd held over her. But his anger surged again. "You're supposed to be with me. I'm all you need, and you're all I need." Victor appeared from the living room, his face a mixture of determination and sorrow. "Philip, this has to stop. You can't treat your mother this way." Philip's fists clenched, but tears welled in his eyes. "She's all I have," he choked. "Out." Sandra stepped forward, her voice trembling but steady. "Philip, I love you more than anything. But this isn't love. Love doesn't trap. Love doesn't control. You need to grow, to become your own person, and I need to let you." Philip stared at her, his defiance fading as the weight of her words settled on him. I didn't mean to hurt you, he whispered, his voice breaking. I know, Sandra said softly, tears streaming down her face. But we need help, Philip. We can't go on like this. Philip finally agreed to therapy, and over time, the walls of their unhealthy bond began to crumble. It wasn't easy there. Were relapses, moments of anger and guilt. But slowly, Philip began to understand that his love for his mother had morphed into something toxic. He realized the importance of boundaries, the need for independence, and the danger of placing anyone on a pedestal. In their final therapy session, Philip turned to Sandra, his eyes filled with a mix of gratitude and remorse. I'm sorry for trying to hold on to you so tightly. I know now that love doesn't mean possession. Sandra smiled through her tears. I'm sorry too, for not letting you grow. But it's never too late to change. Philip worked to rebuild his life. Sandra and Victor began mending their marriage, rediscovering the balance they had lost. Their family was no longer perfect, but it was healing. What do you think about the story? Do you believe love without limits can be dangerous? Can unhealthy bonds be repaired? Or do they always leave lasting scars? Share your thoughts.